having said that, let's get to our message. Let's not pussyfoot around. We're in the book of Hebrews, new priesthood, new hope, new covenant. We're finishing up chapter 11. This is the end. This is the conclusion of the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, new priesthood, new hope, new covenant. Here we are. Where have we been previously? This is where we have been in the book of Hebrews. This is where we've been in chapter 11. We're going to finish chapter 11 today, but where we've been in chapter 11 is going through what faith is and example after example of what's known as, what's thought of as the hall of faith, not hall of fame. See what I did there? Hall of faith, and listing paragons of faith, actual examples from our history, our biblical history, of exemplars of faith and how they lived a life that exhibited, that gave a testimony, that presented a real clear testimony of their faith, that which is not seen, but yet the essence of what is hoped for. And we began our list of 23 by faiths this, by faiths this one, and that one. The first of the 23 by faiths begin before we hit the patriarchs, pre-patriarchal history, by which I'm not talking, when I say patriarchs, I'm not talking about what Barbie the movie is talking about, okay, the patriarchs. I'm talking about the actual patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we begin pre-patriarch, that's Abel, by faith Enoch. They had testimonies. By faith, Noah. Very clear testimony. Build that ark, baby, or your household is not saved. And we've had a couple of leading questions to think about, to tumble and turn around in our minds. One of which was, do we, like Noah, possess the faith to see the future as present certainty? Do we trust that God's presentation of the future is the accurate presentation of the future? Or are we floundering at sea, in a sea of uncertainty? And do we allow the opinion of others around us in our culture to tamp down the expression of our faith or our hope? The scorn of others never trumps our faith. And it leads us to the final question regarding the pre-patriarchs. Does our faith convict the faithless? You got two choices. Actually, you got three choices. Nobody has any effect on anybody whatsoever for any reason. That's one choice. The other choice is the scorn and the pressure from a hostile world tamps down your faith expression. The other choice is your faith so powerful? Does your light so shine among men that though others may scorn, they may be convicted by your faith? Does the faithless get convicted by those who are faithful? Well, food for thought. Let's move on to the patriarchs. By faith, Abraham, he went out to receive an inheritance. He never actually received the inheritance, but nonetheless, he was obedient because he believed by faith. And by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, you'll remember this very famous passage, Genesis 22, he offered up Isaac, the son of promise. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son, the only unique son was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendant shall be called. It's the Abrahamic covenant. And if in Isaac the covenant is passed down and Isaac is sacrificed, that's the end of the covenant as we know it. But Abraham, being a man of faith, in fact, as Galatians refers to him, Galatians 3:6, the man of faith, Abraham. Well, Abraham considered that God is able to raise people, even from the dead, from which he also received him, Isaac, back as a type. So for us, Isaac and the sacrifice of Isaac, or the almost sacrifice of Isaac, the attempted sacrifice of Isaac, that serves as a type of Messiah. Of course, we get into that, and we'll get into that in 2 months when we get into the holiday Rosh Hashanah, and we really study and get down deep into Genesis 22, and we see what the Jewish concepts of Isaac and the sacrifice of Isaac, called the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. But nonetheless, Abraham believed that even if Isaac were sacrificed, because God is a God who keeps his promises, he would necessarily have to bring Isaac back from the dead. The same theology, the same theory by which we apply to our own Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus. That Jesus, because he is the fulfillment of not only Abrahamic covenant, but also the Davidic covenant. In order for the Davidic covenant to be fulfilled, the Messiah had to die and be resurrected. Well, anyway, let's move on. By faith, Isaac, the son of Abraham, blessed Jacob, next generation, Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. The faith of Isaac was so strong enough that he could speak prophetically to the future. Moving to the next generation of patriarchs, by faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. This was his grandchildren. And by faith, Joseph, the son of Jacob, the father of the grandchildren, who are actually adopted by Jacob as his own. But Joseph, when he was dying, because of his faith, by faith, Joseph made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel. This is something that was going to occur in 300-400 years in the future. And Joseph gave orders concerning my bones. Do not leave me buried under a pyramid, people. Take me back to the promised land. Take me back to the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So let's summarize, let's pause, take the pause that refreshes. Do we, as believers, possess an enduring faith that powerfully sustains the confident hope that God's promises will find eventual fulfillment? Do we stand on the shoulders? Do we walk in the footsteps of the patriarchs, those who came before us, looking forward by faith to eventual fulfillment of those promises, even though right now it's hard to see those promises reaching fulfillment? Do we possess a future-oriented faith perspective? That's either a yes, a no. I haven't thought about it. So let's think about it. How can we foster a future-oriented faith perspective? That's a question. Here's another one. How can we help to kindle a future-oriented faith perspective in others? Again, food for thought. Take your own spiritual temperature and think about these. These are probing, penetrating questions, people. Think about them. Answer them for yourselves. And we move on to the Exodus generation. By faith, Moses, by faith, his parents saved Moses, little baby, set him adrift in the basket, adopted by the princess of Egypt in a time of paralyzing dread and devastating loss, time when all the babies, the male babies of that particular generation, were being drowned. Moses' family, their fear was overcome by their faith. By faith, Moses, when he'd grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, because Moses maintained a future-oriented perspective that enabled him to endure temporary suffering. How can you endure this temporary suffering? By maintaining a future-oriented perspective. And that future-oriented perspective enabled Moses to gain God's permanent reward. Temporary suffering? Yeah. He put up with it in order to achieve God's permanent reward. By faith, he, Moses, left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king of Pharaoh, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. In other words, by faith, Moses made his choices. Moses' future-oriented faith in God enabled him to overcome his current fear of Pharaoh. We all have current fears. We all have current pressures. We all have current anxieties. Do you have a faith that is sufficiently future-oriented in order to overcome that which troubles you today? By faith, he, Moses, kept Pesach, the Passover, and the sprinkling of the blood, the doorpost, the lintel of the home. The mention of original Passover here in Hebrews was a reminder to the recipients of Hebrews that once announced, God's judgment is certain. And certainly, just as God had devastated the Egyptians, so he would judge the generation of Israel who had rejected his provision of his son. It has direct application to the readers of Hebrews. At this hour, any attempt by the recipients of Hebrews to temporarily wipe away or cover over the saving blood of the Lamb of God was unthinkable. Yet they were thinking it. But for the author, unthinkable. If you're flirting with this, you're flirting with disaster. Knock it off. Don't flirt with that anymore than the children of Israel flirted with, well, do we really need to paint the doorposts and the lintel with blood? Maybe how about, what if we just take a marker, just a crayon, right? Wouldn't that do? It's both red. No, you had to, by faith, act even though you didn't know whether it would work or not. You had to trust. But God's track record of 10 plagues by that point, or 9 plagues by that point, was pretty good indication that past results would indicate future performance. Speaking of the Exodus generation, by faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land. And that required them to overcome initial fear, apprehension, their misgiving, even their incredulity. But Israel's Exodus generation nonetheless pressed forward by faith. Are we pressing forward by faith? By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they'd been encircled for 7 days. So the question I have for you, what fears, what apprehensions, what misgivings, what feelings of incredulity must be overcome by you to press forward by faith? Again, food for thought. Food by which to gain maturity. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient. She welcomed the spies in peace. Rather than remain associated with the people under divine judgment, Rahab's faith led her to choose decisive identification with the people of God. Exactly what was being asked of the recipients of Hebrews. Now is the time to choose. And I think 2,000 years later, by way of application, it could be said of our generations, that we're being presented right now with a time to choose. And I'm not talking politics. I'm not talking taking sides necessarily. I mean, it's part of it. Taking sides in the cultural debate, cultural war that's broken out in our nation. It's a sideshow. The real question for us as believers is, are we decisively identifying as the people of God? Because a lot of the other stuff that falls into line once you have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. See, the problem with that song, which I love, it goes, the world behind me, the cross before me. Yeah. But While the cross is before us and the world is behind us, we still nonetheless, we move, live, and breathe within that world that is behind us. So it's a matter of priority. It's a matter of identification. And if we identify with the world, we're going to make very different choices than if we identify with our Messiah. And now, of all times, is a time to choose, not privately. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No, now is the time to say it loud and say it with humility, not with pride. Pride goeth before destruction. I've read somewhere, probably Shakespeare, I don't know, I don't remember. But nonetheless, last portion of chapter 11. And what more shall I say? He's giving you some examples, ending with the Exodus generation. And now he's about to, this is what a good rhetorician is. This is what's great. He's moving from specific examples to just a general category of faith paragons. And the argument is so weighty, he's now going to give a rapid fire, boom, boom, boom inventory of notable names and noteworthy accomplishments from Israel's historical record. And because he's pressed for time, or really obviously not time, he's writing, he's pressed for space within the scroll. He's going to use this rhetorical device. Time and space is limited. Speakers still use this today. It's called paralepsis. Who cares? Okay, but it's a rhetoric technique that speakers use artfully and cleverly, and employed by politicians and orators throughout time and culture. What happens is the speaker pretends to avoid mentioning exactly that which he's about to mention. I don't have time to tell you about, and then he proceeds to tell us about this one and what all of them endured. But nonetheless, it's a rhetorical technique to keep people's attention. I don't know if it's working in my example right here with you. Wake up. But it worked very well for the recipients of Hebrews. But if I tell of Gideon and Barak, that's not Obama, that's Jewish Barak from the time of Deborah, the judges, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. So we're moving from Judges and 1 Samuel, and then we move into the major and the minor prophets, very clearly. But nonetheless, let's just, since the author of Hebrews doesn't have time, I always have time to go a little deeper. Let's find out if he did tell of Gideon. See, the thing is, if you are talking to an audience that has an instant familiarity with the stories associated with these particular individuals, then you can get away with speaking in shorthand and say, you know what, I don't really have to, for example, if I were to say, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. I can just mention Abraham Lincoln without giving you really any kind of backstory. Everybody has an image of Abraham Lincoln, or let's talk about George Washington or whatever. But if I say, let's talk about Millard Fillmore, I got to give you a little backstory, okay? So sadly, in the 21st century, these really important Hebrew Bible heroes are not as familiar to us as they would have been to the first century Jewish believers, Hebrews. So let's just assume that we're all on the same page and that we're not familiar with Gideon. So let's just tell of Gideon. Give me a little something important about Gideon. Remember, Gideon goes to fight the Midianites. So Gideon has too many guys, and God said, you know what, we need to bring it down, bring the numbers down so that I get the glory and not you. And so here we are in Judges 7:20-21. Story is in Judges 7. The three companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars, holding it. They're down to just a limited number of soldiers, holding in the left hand the torches, in the right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Every man stood in his place all around the camp, made a lot of noise, made a lot of sound and light. And all the men, Midianites, in the camp ran. They cried out and fled. And it was a resounding defeat by Gideon of the Midianites. A tremendous example of faith. This is the kind of faith that was needed. Don't trust in horses, don't trust in chariots, don't trust in numerical superiority. Let's act that only the Lord can get the glory here. Okay, what about Barak? Again, this is the Jewish Barak from Judges chapter 4. Deborah is the judge, Barak is her general. And Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera, the Gentile general, the Canaanite general, into your hand. The Lord is indeed going before you. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor. That's that really round mountain right in the middle of Israel. And they charge down Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him. And they take on a numerically superior and technologically superior force of Canaanites with chariots. And the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. So by faith, Gideon, by faith, Barak. Who's next? So exciting. Samson. Who doesn't know the story of Samson? Well, maybe there is somebody who doesn't know the story of Samson, who was born of special divine promise, is a Nazarite from birth, is given supernatural strength to fight the Philistines. Occasionally he becomes distracted a little bit and winds up at the very last moments of his life. He is blinded by the Philistines, he is in chains, and he is chained up as an object of ridicule in the Philistine temple to Dagon. And Samson called to the Lord in the midst of blind and in the midst of his most helpless moment. Said, Lord God, remember me and strengthen me only this once. See, the thing is that Samson's a great example. Barak too, actually. But Gideon, also a great. I don't have enough faith. I'm going to put out a fleece. No, I'll put out a second fleece. Okay, so that's Gideon. Barak, going to Deborah. Deborah says, go. She says, I won't go unless you come with me, mommy. And she does. But so even these Samson, man of great promise, who doesn't through his life, doesn't actually achieve his potential. Inconsistency, you know. Doesn't achieve his potential until his death. These are great examples for us because most of us, whether we want to admit it or not, are very similar to these guys, okay? We have moments of glory, they're fleeting. Moments of perfect faith that dissolve like the morning mist. Where'd it go? Right? But the issue raised in Hebrews and in Judges and in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament is, and for us today, is your faith there when it really counts? In the clutch. Yeah, we have ephemeral faith. Some of us are more consistent than others. But all of us have some level of inconsistency. But are we there when it counts? Do we trust God when it really counts? Going back to Samson. Remember me, Lord, and strengthen me only this once. And Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house of Dagon, foreign god, rested. And he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one, his left hand on the other. And then Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he strained with all his might, giving the last ounce of power, of supernatural resource, and of his own self, leaving nothing on the table. Strained with all his might, and the house of the Lord's fell on the Lord's and all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those he killed during his life. Reached his final potential in his last moments. Story of Samson, of Barak, of Gideon, speaks to us today. What about Jephthah? Jephthah, who is that? We remember Jephthah, if we remember at all, because of the vow that he had vowed regarding his daughter. That's not what's important to know about Jephthah. Jephthah, Judges 11, Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. Jephthah's a ruffian. He's a tough guy. It's like an outlaw. He inflicted a massive defeat on them. From Aurora to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 towns as far as Avel Keramim. Tough guy, rough-hewn. But he got the job done. Man who moved by faith. And what about David? Oh my goodness, what couldn't we say about David? Important thing to remember about David is the man after God's own heart, and God gave him what's called the Davidic covenant, this contract. When your days, this is 1 Chronicles 17, 11 through 14, when your days are fulfilled to go up to be with your ancestors, when you kick off, in other words, I'll raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons. I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from him who was before you, but I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. That's why we call Yeshua, Jesus, son of David. Yeshua is Bet David, Ben David. He's indeed the son of David. David was not perfect, but his faith was there when it counted. As Samuel, 1 Samuel 3, the prophet, the last of the judges, is the one who midwifed the transition from judges to the monarchy to first king Saul. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, from top to bottom, from A to Z, in other words, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of Jehovah, of Adonai, of the Lord. And of course, the entire category of the prophets. When we look at these actions here, these individuals that we have just seen, by faith, these guys, Barak and Jephthah and David and by faith, they conquered kingdoms. By faith, they performed acts of righteousness. By faith, they obtained promises. We just saw the Davidic covenant. By faith, they shut the mouths of lions. Well, none of the guys who we read about, who shut the mouths of lions, we know is Daniel. Remember Daniel? One of the prophets. He's in that category here. The king spoke, says Daniel 6. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God. He's in the lion's den. The morning has come. He spent the night with the lions. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve. Pretty great testimony from your boss. Has he been able to deliver you from the lions? Is there anything left of you, in other words, Daniel, to answer me? And Daniel spoke to the king. O king, live forever. My God, the one whom I constantly serve, that you recognize, My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king. I have committed no crime. God shut the mouths of these hungry lions. And the king was very pleased, and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den. No injury whatsoever was found on him. Because, why? By faith, because he had trusted in his God. This is a phenomenal hall of faith. One testimony after another. It's like tag team testimony. Boom, boom, boom. But they quench the power of fire. Now, that's not Daniel. That's a couple of his friends. You know who they are. These three men. Shake the bed, make the bed, to bed we go. I'm sorry, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up, Daniel 3. And Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God. Come here. And then shake the bed, make the bed, to Abednego, came out of the midst of the fire. Not even sunburned. Satraps, the prefect, the governors, the king's high officials gathered around and saw it in regard to these men. But the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair on their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. They do better than me attempting to cook something in the kitchen. You never know if the entire house is going to be filled with the smell of something overdone or smoke. They didn't even have the smoke of an overcooked steak clinging to them. By faith, they endured fire. And they escaped the edge of the sword. This group of people from weakness were made strong. They became mighty in war. They put foreign enemies to flight. We just looked at those first six, the Jephthah and Gideon. Great example of what these guys did. Summary. And see, for the original readers, these examples, Daniel and Jephthah and Gideon and David, these examples powerfully demonstrate that the life by faith triumphs over all, even death. We can explore that a little more deeply in the next line here, that faith, the life lived by faith triumphs over all, even death. We see that very specifically in the next line. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Really? Are there resurrections in the Hebrew Bible? So if you're familiar with the Hebrew Bible, you know, not a lot, but there's two very notable ones, both accomplished by two great prophets, Elijah, and then Elijah Jr., Elisha. I'll show you what I mean. This is Elijah. Elijah, stretched himself, 1 Kings 17. He stretched himself upon the child, dead corpse. The child 3 times, and called to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, I pray you, let this child's life return to him." The Lord heard the voice of Elijah. The life of the child returned to him, and he revived. Resurrection. Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son is alive." And then what about his successor, Elisha? 2 Kings 4. When Elisha came into the house, behold, the lad was dead and laid out on the bed. And so Elisha, went up and lay on the child, and he stretched himself on him. And the flesh of the child became warm. And then he returned, and he walked in the house once back and forth, and went up and stretched himself out upon him again. And the lad sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Corpses do not sneeze even once, because he was no longer a corpse. He sneezed and he opened his eyes. Resurrection. When a life lived by faith was indeed triumphant over the power of death. Now, don't get me wrong. Resurrection, or if you want to call it resuscitation, whatever you want to call it, in the Hebrew Bible, is a very rare fact. These are the 2 examples. It's not normative. But nonetheless, resurrection is the great hope of the Jewish people by the time Yeshua comes. A future resurrection when all will be raised from their graves and God will bring them to the point of judgment. Well, while a life lived by faith was indeed triumphant over the power of death, to possess such faith provided no automatic immunity from either suffering or death. These examples of resurrection. Still, even with the resurrection, you still got to die. And oftentimes, especially for believers, prior to death came a variable level of suffering. That was true in the first century. It was true for the recipients of the letter to Hebrews. And it's true for us today. And it may become not only true, but in our lifetimes, in our days, it might become a truism. That if you are faithful to the Lord, that suffering prior to death is absolutely inevitable. Something for us to think about ahead of time, just in case. Taking the temperature and noting the wind velocity of our culture and our age. Women received back the dead by resurrection. Others were tortured. Others experienced mockings and scourgings. Yes, also chains and imprisonment. So we not only have prophets and men of faith experiencing this in the time of the Hebrew Bible, we also, of course, the book of Hebrews is written to a second generation group of believers. We also have that first generation of believers. Certainly, all of the apostles experienced suffering, mockings, scourgings, chains, imprisonment, etc., etc. They were stoned. Stephen is an excellent example of this in the book of Acts. But we have those who were stoned, righteous ones that were stoned. They were sawn in 2. This is one that most of us are not familiar with, but this is actually not in the scripture, but it is really well established in Jewish, not only legend, but in recordings of Jewish history regarding Isaiah and how Isaiah meets his end. The Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Yevamot 49b, talks about Isaiah's death. Therefore, in order to escape, he, Isaiah, uttered a divine name and was swallowed within a cedar tree. Hides within a cedar tree. And Manasseh, the king, wicked king, his servants brought the cedar tree in which the prophet was hidden, and Manasseh's servants sawed through that tree in order to kill him. And when the saw reached in the point of the tree to where Isaiah's mouth was, the saw kept going and Isaiah died. He was killed. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goat skins. It's not the high life for most people of faith in biblical times. Being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy. It's interesting. These heroes of faith. The author right out says it, straight out, doesn't stutter. So these guys, these examples for us, these were people. Man, it's just a general, it's not speaking about males of whom, it's people, humanity. People of whom the world was not worthy. We live in a culture that arguably, and in an age, we could arguably say, yeah, our culture, our age, our nation, not worthy of those of us who follow Yeshua. That's always been true. You always have to make your choices within the culture you live. The culture generally doesn't follow your example. The culture follows its own whim. And if you're lucky, you maintain your testimony in the midst of a morally disintegrating world. Wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And all these, having gained a testimony through the faith. In other words, everybody who we've just listed, all by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. And those we have no time to talk about, but I just did. Okay, all of this group, this hall of faith, all of this entire hall of faith, having gained a testimony through their faith. In other words, we follow their example. Their faith provides an example, a testimony for us to look up to. Having gained a testimony through their faith, not through their courage, not through their strength, not through their erudition, but their testimony was gained through their faith. And none of those people who received promises from the Lord received what was promised. Very easy to see with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they didn't receive what was promised. Moses, he didn't receive what was promised, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. David, although he received the covenant, he did not live to see, he prophetically saw in the future through God's Spirit, but he did not live to see the promised son of David come, the promised Messiah. These, having gained the testimony through their faith, did not receive what was promised. So why did God delay his fulfillment of his promises to the Old Testament believers? Why? Why didn't they receive a scintilla of what God promised them and what God promised the Jewish people? Well, let's stay for a moment on that question. See, both Old and New Testament believers, connected through our common faith, Old Testament and New Testament believers, God delayed the fulfillment of his promises to Old Testament believers because he was waiting for us. God delayed the fulfillment of promises to the Old Testament believers because the fulfillment awaited us showing up, i.e., God's church, new covenant believers, and the inauguration of the new covenant. Because God, it's the final verse of chapter 11, tying everything together with a nice bow and a ribbon, because God had provided something better for us. Better than what? Better than the Old Testament. Better than the Mosaic Law. Better than the Levitical priesthood. Better than the Mosaic covenant. Better than the previous hope that is available now through the new covenant. God had provided something better for us. So that apart from us, listen to this because this is mind-blowing. Apart from us, they would not be made perfect. So that apart from us, who's us? The church, believers, New Covenant believers. Apart from the New Covenant believers, the church, those under the Mosaic law, those under the Old Covenant, those great heroes of the faith, they, apart from us, could not be made perfect. It took the inauguration, in other words, of a new covenant through the death, through the resurrection of our Messiah, along with the establishment of participants in that covenant, for any of God's people to enjoy the perfection that God has made possible for us, for believers. Because no matter what dispensation you're in, no matter what historical era you are in, Yeshua is, according to Hebrews, the author, the perfecter of our faith. Hebrews 12:2, who has perfected for all time those who are sanctified. Hebrews 10:4, through his sacrifice, Yeshua has perfected the faithful of all time and through all time. Hebrews 12:23, we're not there yet. Let's close it up. Do I? I'm not exempting myself from this. Do we possess an enduring faith that can powerfully sustain a confident hope? It's easy to gin up a temporary confident hope. Can get ourselves psyched up. But what about powerfully sustaining that confidence? Can we powerfully sustain a confident hope and with our faith that God's promises will find eventual fulfillment? Or do we run out of gas? Somebody who is filled with gas to the breaking point, but is easily popped like a balloon, or that is filled with gas, but then in the course of a limited period of time, that gas is all expelled, nothing left over. Well, those are called gas bags either way. Are you a gas bag, or are you built to endure? Can you powerfully sustain a confident hope that God's promises will find eventual fulfillment? So, what would you be willing to endure for the sake of your faith? What would I be willing to? These are not esoteric abstractions. I'm asking them because I read the news, and so do you. I'm asking these questions now, posing them, so that reading current news, one can potentially extrapolate let's say, a series of particular possibilities. So what would you be willing to endure for the sake of your faith? You better think about it now. Don't wait until the moment of truth. And if you are willing to endure this or that or whatever for the sake of your faith, what's going to sustain you as you're forced to endure hardship or deprivation? I'm not saying it's coming, but we all read the same and watch the same current events. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. So we better have something to sustain us as we're forced to endure hardship and deprivation. I mean, just in case I'm going to be hungry, or even worse, my family will be hungry, I've made provision with some long-term food. Got some long-term food. Right? It's probably as much as insurance. I might never break into them. We might never break into them. But they're there. That's in case my tummy's rumbling. I always make sure that I have at least an extra month supply of whatever medications I need or use irregularly that I like to have around the house. Because there might be a time when the supply chain for medications might have slowed down and medications aren't available when you need them the moment that you need them. I don't like to, so I make sure so that I don't have to physically endure hardship in that particular area in case, let's say, my back says ow, or my blood pressure is going bibbity-bobbity, blah, blah, blah. Or make sure I have some. So I've taken some steps to sustain me. But what's going to sustain you in a holistic sense? And the answer, according to Hebrews, is you better have a faith that is strong enough, a faith muscle that is strong enough to do heavy lifting if required. I probably shouldn't say if required. I probably should simply say when required. And if your faith muscle right now has somewhat atrophied, you all know I'm going through, this back issue, right? Okay, you don't realize until you lose some of the strength of your spine, how creaky other parts, compensating parts like thighs, for example, are. How non-limber I had grown doing physical therapy. Okay, move your legs like this. I'm trying, but they don't go that far as you want them to go. Okay, it's going to take some time for that knee to get to as far up my chest as you think it belongs. Right? So I got to work at that. Our faith is like that too. And some of our faith, because, hey man, it's America and the living is easy. It's Texas, for goodness sake. We're the buckle in the Bible Belt. For most of us, living our faith, it's an easy thing. And it's an easy thing to slide by with the least amount of dynamic tension. Going back to Charles Atlas now, for those of you over the age of 40. What's going to sustain you? The answer has to be by faith. So take your faith temperature. Do a little stress test on your faith right now while it doesn't cost anything. And worst comes to worst. Do you see yourself standing strong? Or do you see yourself buckling under? Do you see yourself being the latest iteration? How cool would it be for us to be the latest examples in a long line in the hall of faith that the author of Hebrews has begun to enumerate in chapter 11? And 2,000 years later, that hall of faith has continued through time and geographic space. Would we be added to that list? Could we be added to that list? Well, you don't know until actually the time comes. But now is the time to start thinking about it. All right, well, that's enough of this. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to be gloomy and doomy, okay, about that. Our culture's enough of that. But it's trying to be straight up with you guys. I'm not sugarcoating the Word of God. The Word of God is here for a purpose. It served a purpose for the first century believers in the book of Hebrews. And it serves that purpose today, 2,000 years later, for every generation that has come since. To raise those difficult questions, how then shall we live? I don't want our congregation to just be a social club. As much as I love seeing your fine faces, your friendly faces, breaking bagels with you and enjoying a lovely joke and having good times together. This is a training ground, remember? A learning center. I say that every week. What are you being trained for? We're being trained for the competition, for the endurance contest that awaits us in the future. So let's stay strong so that I don't have to say, gentlemen, this is a football, okay? We're beyond that. We can move forward by faith. Let's stand for the Aaronic benediction.